Hey, this is Meunier, and thanks again for tuning back in. This is the second audio blog I've been doing in this sort of ongoing game dev-ish blog series, where it's kind of like a podcast, kind of just me talking into the universe about some things that are relevant to game making and being a creative professional and entrepreneur. And yeah, I mean, a lot of it is important stuff that I've been kind of thinking about a lot as I've been going through the process of learning to do new things and struggling. So I think it's worth sharing some of this stuff and talking about these things. This episode, I'm going to talk about making games and mental health, which are two things that don't always feel like they're conducive to having a positive balance. And I've spoken about this before in different podcasts and things, but I struggle with things like depression and anxiety, and I'm not always in the best state of mind all the time. And I think that tends to be kind of exacerbated by the fact that I work remotely. I freelance full time, so I'm here in my little office here in my little corner of the rural Vermont area, and there's just not a lot of industry around here. So I work from home. I make games every second that I'm not working, essentially, and that's kind of a cycle that I enjoy, but also can be kind of very not necessarily a positive thing all the time. It's hard to find that balance. So the thing about making games is it can be a really great creative outlet for expressing yourself. And in the past, for me, that's been, doing things like making heavy metal music or artwork or writing and finding ways to channel different things that I've experienced, that emotions or troubles or struggles or sort of darker thoughts into art and creativity is a great way to kind of channel that so that it's providing like a positive result. So you're making things to kind of exercise these sort of inner demons. And that's part of the reason why I gravitate towards making horror games, or at least I have. I haven't put out a ton of games, but a lot of the things I'm working on are very much kind of exploring that darker territory of horror and just kind of not necessarily always grisly, gruesome, blood splattery type stuff, but just sort of dark themes that kind of align with some of the things I think about a lot, even though it's not one-to-one like my brain, but it definitely have moments where I'm just not in a good space, and I find channeling that into creative projects is really useful. I also just really like horror games, so I'm really into the sort of the dark psychological stuff, and that's sort of what got me to gravitate towards heavy metal and things back in the day when I was younger and wilder and crazier. Yeah, so I think finding ways to express yourself through games can be really beneficial in terms of getting some of the ickiness out of your head and into something that can be productive. I guess that's sort of one of the reasons why a game dev has kind of resonated with me so much, is I found that it's a way for me to kind of dig back into getting some of that stuff out and channeling that into a positive direction. But at the same time, though, I think making games is really difficult. I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize what's involved with creating a game idea from scratch and then executing that and building it out and then launching it and having it be a successful project. It's a tremendous amount of work. And, until you really go through that cycle, it's really hard to kind of know what that is like. And it's not different from other types of creative things like making books and other things, but it definitely is very intensive, and it can be kind of a crazy roller coaster. And I think that's maybe part of the reason why a lot of developers, especially if they're indie or working by themselves or working remotely, kind of struggle with issues of like depression or anxiety or other kinds of like mental health struggles that can be really debilitating and very hard to manage. So the challenges of like making and launching a game are really difficult to deal with sometimes, especially if you're not in a good space. Like, for me, when I'm feeling good and able to kind of function on a high level, I can be really productive and that feels great. But there's some times where it's just really difficult. So I think talking about that is really useful because I know that other people out there sort of experience that, and I experienced that a lot, especially of late. It's been really difficult, and I'm just sort of trying to work through stuff, I think, and create projects that I feel happy about and hopefully find some sort of resonance with an audience. But you just never know, and it's sort of one of the challenges of being sort of a creative and pushing towards building your professional world around something that it's very subjective and not necessarily attuned with what everybody wants to consume in terms of like making something to sell. But anyway, so getting back to like making games and mental health, I think one of the biggest challenges that a lot of indie folks probably struggle with if they're not close to sort of a major center of activity is isolation. And when you work from home or when you're working on a computer, when you're developing things, it's very easy to get tunnel vision and be focused so intently on the project you're working on that you kind of block out the outside world and throw yourself into this deep dive of coding or creating or art or whatever. And for me, I found that it's very easy to forget that there's even an outside world for the most part. Like I work so much and I create all the time, and I kind of obsessive about being creative and being productive and doing things all the time. So if I'm not being creative or productive, it feeds back into that sort of negative loop of not feeling great about things. So it's sort of a balance of like, do I spend all of my waking moments making games and trying to create these things that I'm really excited about and I want to share with people and I want to find success with eventually, but at what cost? Like, what's the cost of that, of not being in touch with sort of the human world and not really interacting with people as much as I should, or, making positive, healthy choices about, getting up and getting exercise and connecting with people. So I live in rural Vermont, so there's really no game development communities anywhere within like a reasonable distance to me without having to like get in a car and drive 5 hours. And that really sucks personally. I mean, I don't get a chance to get out to GDC, and I've been watching a lot of GDC videos online, which is great that they post those on the Vault. It's been really interesting, and it's been cool to see how some of the other developers out there face similar kind of struggles. And I think that's maybe that sort of is what triggered me to kind of talk about this a little bit in this episode. But because I don't live anywhere near where there's people that kind of understand what I do or really connect. I mean, I have a small team of indie developer folks that I have a studio with. So when we get together and work on stuff, it's really cool. But outside of those two guys, it's really pretty isolating here. And yeah, that's one of the things I struggle with the most, I think, is I want to have that sort of connection with the outside world and be human, I guess. But it's not easy to do. And I find myself kind of being more inclined to shut out the world and kind of become a shut-in. And I think that's really dangerous. It's not a healthy thing to be doing in terms of, if you're a professional, if you're anybody really, but like, especially if you're making games or you're doing something where you're pouring so much of your sort of time and energy into something with the risk that maybe it's not going to pan out. There's sort of this danger of like putting all of yourself into the thing that might ultimately fail or might not do what you need it to do, and that becomes sort of an ultra negative dampener on your sort of worldview. Launching a game is super tough. I'm in the process of launching a game, which I've mentioned sort of in the last episode, and that's one of the things that sort of makes me nervous about is that there's a lot of dark tunnels you can kind of find yourself funneled into when you're creating something and launching it and relying on it to potentially create some income to help you find, get where you need to with your professional world, or just, whatever. For me, it's the case of like trying to pay bills and stuff and get caught up, because I do work full time and on top of making games. And I think for the past 3 years since I've started making games, I've sacrificed a lot of personal connections, like just spending time out in the world. And that's, a choice I've made and sort of something I've naturally been drawn to do because I want to succeed. I'm driven to kind of create things and learn new things. And that's a big part of what makes my brain tick. But it sort of is a double-edged sword because it makes me feel like I don't really belong here where I am or anywhere. So one of the things I've found to kind of combat this is, social media. Twitter has been really useful. I use it a lot, and I kind of I think that's one of my main connections with the industry is, interacting with people, following game developers, messaging people back and forth and kind of talking about stuff and sharing things. But the problem with social media and Twitter is that it can very much be sort of like a one-sided conversation. Like, I often feel like I'm kind of blasting things out into the world at people, like, oh, this and that. And it's not always, buy my thing or do this thing. Sometimes it's just fun stuff or weird stuff. But at the same time, like, that can become a really negative feedback loop too, because if people respond and you find connection through that can be really good, because it's like, oh, people are out there. Like, it feels good to have sort of a response to things. But other times, you may, like, maybe I'll spend time like pouring into creating an article or doing a thing and putting it out there. And if there's no response, if people don't see it, and that's often happens on Twitter because it's such sort of like a tornado of content, you're sort of just like throwing things into it and they evaporate. But like, it's not really a great, way to, I don't know, it's difficult because you can't really rely on stuff like social media and Twitter to be like your main connection with the world, and have that be like a healthy thing. Even when people respond to me and I'm talking back and forth and stuff, it's sort of very just much on a surface level. And that's not really, like, that's great sometimes, but when you're in sort of these dark tunnels of feeling not good about things, that doesn't help. And sort of like, it's not really a lifeline. It's not really sort of a good mechanism to kind of keep on a positive track and sort of rebuild those connections that you sacrifice being someone who lives out in the middle of nowhere, who spends all of their time making things for people that maybe don't even care so much, I guess. So I think isolation is really a big challenge that a lot of independent developers and creative folks who live kind of out in different pockets of the world, making games and things, suffer from. And it's not an easy problem to overcome. And I think finding online communities is really useful, but social media, while it can be really great, isn't really a great solution. At least I haven't found it to be. I don't really feel like satisfied from being on Twitter, even though I do really enjoy interacting with people that way. It just doesn't feel like the kind of connections when you're sitting down and having a beer with someone, just like talking shop, or, you don't really get that from a lot of social media interactions. So I think maybe that's why I'm doing some of these podcasty type things, because I feel like at least I'm talking to something, even if it's not really anybody out there listening necessarily. It feels good to exercise those sort of basic human communication skills that I kind of have let go to the wayside in the past couple of years, and particularly in the past few months. I don't really talk to a lot of people in general. I don't really see people lately, since I've been sort of in the middle of crunching on finishing my next game project. There's days where I'll go through and I don't even see other people except for my wife and my pets, which is great, and I love them all. And it's tough to not have any sort of anybody to really talk to, I guess. So these are getting a little bit off track and rambly, but the idea, I think, with a lot of these audio blogs that I'm trying to get is to kind of focus on a topic and maybe riff on that a little bit and just share some thoughts. So if you like this stuff, that's great, and you want to share it, let folks know, or comment on my blog or whatever, that's cool. I appreciate sort of the feedback, and I definitely want to talk about a lot of different things. Not all of them are going to be sort of so gloomy, woomy, but I figured it was just kind of important to get some of these stuff out, as it's sort of like something I'm really going through right now and just trying to work through, and this is helpful. So yeah, all right, thanks a bunch. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at NMEUNIER, and my website, www.nathanmeunier.com, is where you can find my books and bloggy stuff and game projects and all that other good stuff. Anyway, thanks again. See you next time.